Welcome to episode 131 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, so the word all spelled out, seven health.com/131.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey all, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. So on the show this week, I'm sitting down with a guest, and my guest is Marya Hornbacher. So Marya is an award-winning journalist, a best-selling author, and the recipient of a host of awards for her books, journalism, essays, and poetry. She was shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize for her first book, Wasted, which she wrote when she was 22, and since then has spent a prolific 20-odd years writing and teaching across genres. So I first became aware of Marya about 3 years ago. So her first book, Wasted, is her memoir about her struggles with an eating disorder. So given what I do and my interest in the topic, I gave it a read, and honestly, I was floored. I had to keep reminding myself that this was written by a 22-year-old because the writing was so raw and intense and skillful. And I remember having this conversation with Kate Solo when she was on the podcast, and we were chatting about the book, and she remarked that just because you've gone through something, whether that be an eating disorder or overcoming addiction or climbing Mount Everest, doesn't make you a writer. But Marya clearly is one, and it shines through in this book. So Wasted is an incredibly dark book, and sharing the gory details of the destruction that she went through over the 10 plus years that she struggled with an eating disorder. And as we actually talk about in the conversation, the book has received some criticism because of the details that it goes into. And as Marya mentions, she didn't know that for some people struggling with an eating disorder, there is glamour in the destruction. So when I read the book, I read about this hell of a place that I wouldn't wish on anyone. But for someone in the depths of an eating disorder, it can be triggering to keep going or to restrict more. And the reason I'm going into these details is I'm always wary of who I recommend the book to. For people who've never had an eating disorder, go and read it. It is incredibly dark and gripping and a fantastic story. But for someone who has suffered with an eating disorder, it's probably best to hold off until well into recovery. And there's a point when talking with clients where if they look back at old photos when they were their sickest or at their lowest weight, it's triggering and they wish they could go back there. But at some point, this changes. They look at those same photos and they start to see what everyone else saw. They see the struggle and the depths, and they see past the stories that they've been telling themselves and know what a hellhole that was. Well, I think the same thing about Wasted. At some point, it is a good book for someone to read in recovery because the story becomes no longer tantalizing. It's just dark and agonizing and somewhere that someone doesn't want to go back to. And this may not be the same for everyone. There are undoubtedly people who are in the depths of their disorder and read Wasted, and it is critical for them getting into recovery and helping them out of that place. But I am giving this long caveat because I don't want to cause unnecessary harm. And with Marya's second memoir, this is Madness, and this is about her suffering with bipolar disorder and the 10 to 12 year period of her life when this was at its worst. And like Wasted, it is incredibly well written. And when I had Chevy Ruff on the podcast, we spoke about mental health issues, and it was really well received. It's a topic that's coming more into the public consciousness, and we should be having more of a conversation about. So when I read Madness, which I did fairly recently, I decided to get in contact with Marya and invite her on the show. So the episode is us using her two memoirs as the basis for our conversation. So eating disorders and bipolar. And because Marya is an award-winning writer and has such a gift in this area, we also talk about the writing process and tips for writers. And I actually caught her on the first day of an intensive writing retreat that she's doing for the next, I think it's 3 months. So talking about the writing process was definitely front of mind. So with this long intro out of the way, here is my conversation with Marya Hornbacher. Hey Marya, thanks for joining me on the show today. I'm really excited to finally have a chance to chat with you.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So it was probably 2 or 3 years ago, probably 3 years ago, that I first came across your work and read your first memoir, Wasted. And recently I've read Madness, which is your second memoir, and it kind of picks up where Wasted finished off. And so I want to use both of those books as part of our conversation today. And I would also really love to dig into your writing process as well, because you clearly have a gift with the written word. So that's a bit of an overview of what I want to go through. But as a starting place for any of the listeners who don't know who you are, do you want to give a bit of background on yourself? And we're going to dig into this stuff in more detail, but do you want to just describe who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's funny. I've written a lot about mental health. I've written about eating disorders. I've written about mental illness. But when you ask me, give an overview of yourself, the first thing I say is, well, I'm a writer and I'm a journalist. And so, my sense of myself has very little to do with eating disorders or mental health, but I'm certainly passionate about those topics. They're areas I've written about extensively in both memoir and in opinion pieces and in novel and in other forms. But mostly what I do on a day-to-day basis is write books and spend time with people. So that's a little bit of a here and now overview. But in my past, I really struggled with eating disorders for many years. I also have a diagnosis of bipolar and have I consider it mental health recovery. Some people don't care for the term recovery, but I like it. And so I've been in recovery from mental illness for a long time as well. So that kind of sums me up.
Okay, so going into a little bit more detail on the eating disorder side. So that's your first book, Wasted. Are you able to give a bit more of an overview and a bit more detail about that and your experience?
Sure. It was I think like anybody who's gone through an eating disorder knows all too well, it's a hellish experience for any of us and also for the people around us. My eating disorder started very early. I was about 9 when I started delving into disordered eating and bulimic behavior. As I got older, it transitioned into a mishmash of eating disordered behaviors. I became I consider it in many ways addictive, if not a strict addiction. I was very, very the thinking and the emotional turmoil that goes along with any addiction, and that certainly goes along with disordered eating. I was quite ill. I nearly died. I was, all the usual. In some ways, it's a very familiar path to those of you, and to you certainly, who deal with that illness. I started recovery when I was about 19 years old. I was hospitalized for the last time when I was 19 and was in the hospital for a long time. And that's when I really started looking at what are the elements that went into creating this disorder and what are the skills that I might possess still that will help me get out. And that's really when my recovery took off.
And so what were those elements then? Because that sounds like it's quite an interesting piece that people will want to hear. And I know everyone is different, but that seems like quite a significant part.
Sure. I think the elements that go into it are, it's like we have different degrees of it for each of us. The pieces of the pie are different for each of us. I think for me, a lot of what went into developing the disorder was all the typical stuff, perfectionism and ambition and a sense of a lack of sense of self in a way. Also, certainly there were family elements. And then I really feel that for me and for, I think a lot of people, maybe increasingly, you would know more about that than I would about the current state of things. The cultural influences that we deal with are really profoundly degradatory to our mental health and
Sure.
to our sense of self and to our sense of body and to our sense of, in a way, hunger. I think it really damages us in some ways, and we have to find ways to strengthen our inner sense of strength, our inner self, in order to combat some of those external cultural forces. The elements that go into recovery for me were so many. I really take a strengths-based approach. And so when I started recovering from eating disorders, which was a very long time ago, we didn't really have, first of all, people didn't believe you could recover. They really flat out said, well, and I still hear this from people and it frustrates me. People say, well, I know I'll deal with this for the rest of my life, which I think is largely garbage. Because I don't deal with it now, and I'm in the rest of my life. I also know a whole lot of people who don't deal with the eating disorders and the disordered eating that they dealt with earlier in their lives. So I don't think these are necessarily chronic disorders. I think these are things that we can move beyond. For me, moving beyond it meant looking at what was it that I was actually hungry for? What were the elements that were missing in my life? So for me, recovery was partly physical, partly spiritual, partly emotional. All of those were pieces that had to get put back in place in order for me to get my feet back on solid ground. There's the little stuff like you have to learn how to eat. And people, I think, disregard that that's an important piece of recovery. You really do have to be able to learn to comfortably and healthily feed your body. So I think, when we get caught up in the emotional aspect of it, we disregard the fact that the body is pretty important and we have to take better care of it.
Yeah.
When we get to the emotional elements of it, I think getting to what are the things I'm good at? What are the things I'm passionate about? What are the things I really love in my life? When you're deeply in a disordered space, it's hard to see what you're passionate about, what you love. But those are the things that will help you get well. And so when I talk to people, when people say, how did you want to get well? I kind of had to start with that sort of negative theology and go, I just didn't want to be sick anymore. I didn't want the disorder anymore. And so finding anything I could want to live for was really elementally important as well.
And it's nice. I mean, all of the different areas you've touched on there are things that I work on with clients. And I think there was an interview that I read where you said like something to the effect that recovery, in a sense, is quite boring. It's just like doing the things over and over again that you need to do. There's not as many of the aha moments that people think that there's going to be. It's just putting one foot in front of the other and doing it day after day, which I think is pretty true from a lot of the work that I do.
Yeah, I think, we're expecting there to be one moment where suddenly, I think people often ask me, when did you know you wanted to get well? They're expecting there to have been sort of that lightning bolt that hit me. And I was like, aha, now I know I want to get well. It really wasn't like that. Life isn't that dramatic. I love the idea that it is, but it really is not. And so some of getting better is knowing that it isn't all going to be highs and lows. There's a lot of middle ground, and that middle path. There's a lot of work in mindfulness and Buddhism that teaches us a lot about how to get through the day-to-day, the boring parts, the middle road, and some of those things can be really beautiful when we learn to see how much they heal us. Those aha moments are great when they come, but they're not the substance of how we get better, to my mind.
No, and I would agree. And I think because it takes so long that there are going to be a lot of moments where it's just the daily grind and just getting through it, where it's just about putting in the time and just doing the things.
Absolutely. It's like training for a marathon in a lot of ways. Most of it's not the marathon. Most of it is the training. The marathon's one day out of a year. And the rest of the year, you're just training. And that's okay. That's got to be okay.
So then the book, so how did that come to be? And when you first started writing it, was the intention for it to be a book, or is it some exercise in trying to piece together and make sense of what had happened?
That's such a great question. It was not an exercise in trying to piece together what had happened. The original idea behind that book was, it was never even going to be a memoir. It was going to be a feminist critique of pop culture and its influence on the way we understand our bodies. The fact that it's a memoir has very much to do with the publishing world and what I was very young when I wrote it. And so what they said over and over was, hey, tell us more of your story, tell us more of your story, tell us more of your story. And so gradually and somewhat begrudgingly, I did that, for better and worse. And so I think that I have very mixed feelings about that first memoir. I think it's an okay book as a book, but it has, it really occupies an odd part of my heart. When I wrote it, I did not really know very much about memoir, for one thing. We didn't have it. There was no memoir boom. There was no body of literature on eating disorders. It wasn't a whole genre unto itself. None of that existed. And for that matter, it might help people to understand that the internet didn't exist.
Yeah.
The word trigger was not part of the vocabulary. We didn't know anything about pro-Anna. Pro-Anna didn't exist yet. All of this came in the aftermath of the internet. And so when I wrote that book, there was a lot I didn't know that I really wish I would have, because I would have done it a little differently. But in writing it, I think it did help me in terms of piecing together how strongly I wanted to get better. As I went, I increasingly found that I wanted to get further and further away from the disorder. But I do know this. I get thousands of letters from people saying that it helped them see the disorder for what it is and helped them want to get better. That's the good side.
Yeah. And also referencing you saying hey, there was no internet. It was a long time ago. For people who don't know, this book was written, I think, 20 years ago. So it is a long time ago.
20 years ago. Yep.
As you said, you were 23. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm 36 now. God, I had to check. So I'm 36. I would be held accountable for things that I'd written when I was 23 because I would have thought very differently about the world. And so I think to then put you up to these impossible standards when all of the world has changed in terms of our knowledge around the illness, I think could be a little unfair.
I think it's a little unsettling more than anything. I wish we had known how much would change in pop culture at that time. We had email. I was actually 22 when the book was written. And so, that's exactly half my life ago. I'm 44 now. And so there's a real beauty in having gone a long way beyond that. But there's also, the fact is when you write a book, you set it down on paper, you are accountable for that. And so I want to make sure that I remain mindful of the fact that those were my words and that was what I knew. And that's all that I knew.
Yeah. And what was the response like at the time? So I know it's kind of thought as a cult classic now, but did it instantly do really well? Was it a slow burn? What was the reception?
The reception was pretty startling and pretty great. No one had ever talked about it before. And I know that sounds crazy now because we talk about it all the time. But the whole purpose of that book was to get people to have a conversation about eating disorders and their role in, at that time, primarily women's lives. That was by no means restricted to women. But what we knew was that women were suffering pretty gravely in silence. And now we know that it is not gender restricted, it is not racially restricted, it is not age restricted, it is absolutely indiscriminate in who is affected by disordered eating. But at the time, we really needed to talk about it in the framework of what was going on with gender and pop culture. This was the second wave of feminism, and so it was at the height of our awareness that people needed to be talking about women's stories more. And so it was part of it. It was a moment in time, but the response was that people were very, very happy finally to be talking about it. Simply to have the elephant in the living room addressed. You know what I mean? I don't know if that's a colloquialism that translates, but simply to be talking about what had been silenced. Okay, good. It had been so hushed up for so long and so kind of whitewashed and glamorized and glorified. The point of the book was to take some of that glamour away. What we didn't know, and I certainly didn't know, was that people, when they are ill, find glamour in self-destruction. And I wish we knew more about that today, even. I wish we knew more about that today.
And I mean, you said when you were writing it, they kept feeding back notes of tell us more about your story. Did that mean that the intended audience shifted, or what you were trying to do with the book shifted in terms of like stopping eating disorders or helping people with eating disorders? Yeah.
I think, my intended audience and the audience it ultimately had, that has changed over time. My intended audience was the general audience, and also the loved ones of people with eating disorders. As anybody who reads the book knows, there's nothing in it that someone with an eating disorder doesn't already know. What I underestimated was how many people would be glad to have their stories told. I didn't realize how badly we as a community needed that story out there. And I'm very grateful for that, for the fact that people have told me, you told my story. I mean, because my story, Marya, one person, well, who cares? But because it is the story of so many thousands of people, that I think became elementally important. And so as I wrote, them telling me more and more, tell us more of your story, tell us more of your story, I think that was partly a marketing ploy. I think the memoir boom was just about to happen. It was early in the memoir boom. And they really wanted a memoir. And I really wanted a very academic little critique of feminism in the 1990s, so we wanted different things. Over time, I think I have come to terms with what it became and the fact that it, of course, is a memoir, enough such that I wrote another memoir. So memoir is not like a form I don't like. But it really did change my understanding of what the book was for. It stopped being an argument that I was making, and it started being a story I was telling.
And it's interesting that you said that part of the intention was for a general audience, because when I think of a good documentary,
Yeah.
I think of something that is engrossing and fascinating, even if you have no prior knowledge or interest in a topic that is covered. And I definitely feel this way about your memoirs, that even if you don't have an interest in eating disorders or you don't have an interest in mental illness, they are definitely great books that are gripping and riveting to read, and that people should sort of check them out. So yeah, I know that's a slight tangent, but it was just something I wanted to kind of flag.
It's great to hear. That's great to hear.
And I know then sort of, I think it was like the 15-year anniversary of the book, you included an afterword, which seemed a little bit at odds of how the book had originally ended. So do you want to describe this and what made you change your view or change your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. Time made me change my mind. Time and experience. I think, the original book that came out in 1998 ended on such a note of ambiguity of, I don't know if I'm ever going to get better. I don't know how to get better, and that's, it had all kinds of loose ends. And one of the things I really love about the book, if there are, if I can be said to love it, is the fact that it doesn't try to tie it up. It doesn't try to put it in a little bow and say, and then I was struck by lightning and got better, because that doesn't happen. What I really wanted to do with that afterward was let people know two things. First of all, that full recovery is possible. And two, that it takes time. It takes time and it takes effort. And I wanted that to be reassuring to readers, because the book in its original format is so dark and so uncertain. And that's really reflective, of course, of where I was when I wrote it. Yep. By the time I wrote the afterword in 2014, I was well. Eating disorders weren't on my mind anymore. And so when they contacted me and said, do you want to do anything for the anniversary of this 15-year anniversary? I said, absolutely. I want to say I was wrong. I want to say that ambiguity, that darkness is not a permanent condition. One of the last quotes in the book is from Emily Dickinson about winter. It's about how it's from a formal feeling comes. It talks about how cold things are after an eating disorder, and that's not true. It was true at the time. It was, to the best of my knowledge, what was true. But what's true over time, if you do decide that you're going to get past the disordered eating and if you're going to get past the illness, it isn't like that. You can go on with your life and you can have a really quite a beautiful life free of the illness. And I wanted people to know that, and I wanted them to be reassured by that.
And what was then the response in terms of that? Because, I mean, obviously there was some criticism in terms of the book that you talked about before. Did that help people in terms of reading that new afterword?
I don't know. I think mostly what I get from people in terms of mail, email, notes, messages, etc., is people saying that one way or the other, the book as a whole, with or without the afterwards, helped them see what was going on in their lives. What I have heard from people about the afterward is that it kind of brought them up short after reading such a graphic account of the eating disorder. Hearing then that I am very adamant in the afterward that people do need to get well, that it's something of a responsibility that we have. If we know we can, we have to. I think, there's such fatalism within the community of providers sometimes who help us. There's such a sense of chronicity. What I wanted to break through with that afterward was that it may not be chronic. It doesn't have to be chronic. And so I think that when people read that, it may give them a sense of, oh, not only could I get well, I kind of got to do that, And so what I've heard from people is that brings a sense of awareness to them that they may not have had.
Okay. And so, I mean, you touched on some of this already, that things have definitely changed from when you were going through an eating disorder to now. I mean, what can you think of as being some of the biggest differences? And this could be in terms of treatment, it could be in terms of what we understand, etc. For someone like yourself who was suffering with bulimia and anorexia in the 80s and 90s versus where things are now.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think social media has really had a devastating effect, I think, on eating disorders, and has increased them exponentially, increased our vulnerability to them, and increased their incidence quite profoundly. Social media, I think, isn't evil in itself. And I go on Facebook now and then myself, but I think the fact that we are so constantly alert, hyper alert to how people see us, whether visually or personality wise. We talked about a cult of personality in the 80s and 90s, and now that cult of personality is quite visual. Yeah. And so I think people are very, very, we follow people on Instagram because of how they look. Well, who cares? To me, that's really bewildering, but I know that is very, very consuming to a lot of people. What I think is that we have become an almost entirely visual culture, and that is devastating to people who already have a vulnerability to being sensitive about how they look, or who are self-conscious about how they look, or who are body conscious. And many, 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 many people are body conscious. I won't say everyone, but certainly quite a lot of people struggle with that. So that has changed. Social media has changed us. I wish I could say treatment has changed. I think treatment, to some extent, now there are providers who recognize that recovery is possible, but I still think that there is a really profound revolving door factor in treatment, and that people are not encouraged to fully recover, but are encouraged to think of their issue as chronic. And when we are encouraged to think that it is chronic, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. I wish treatment was more like, okay, you're here, sort it out, figure it out. And I wish we had better tools to help people do that figuring out in short-term intensive stays. But the treatment that I see that really works is stuff like mindfulness-based stuff, and things that have to do with getting people outside and into nature. The places I see not working, or the types of treatment I see not working, are the same treatments we had in the 80s and 90s. And they were just to feed us and send us on our merry way. And what's changed? We've been fed, but we really haven't fundamentally changed as people. And that's really where the change has to happen.
Yeah. And look, I think from my work that I do with people, it's very much marrying up those two things, because
Yeah.
the mindfulness piece, the yoga piece, the getting outside is great. But if someone's not eating the food, then nothing's going to happen. But at the same time, if someone's eating food, but it's just being forced upon them and they hate every moment of it, and you're not dealing with all of the things that kind of brought this to the fore, then as soon as they then get out, then it will just go back. So yeah, it's kind of getting those two things to work in tandem.
Absolutely. I mean, so much of it has to do with integration of the body mind stuff. I mean, we are not just bodies. We are not just minds. We are one whole organism, and the whole thing has to be dealt with in treatment.
Yeah, definitely. And do you think, do you see any positivity or hope in that changing in terms of your comments about it being seen as a chronic illness? Is there any glimmer of hope that you're seeing in the treatment world?
I see some places, and they get really sniffed at by kind of the mainstream world. I see some places that I think are doing really, really good work with 12-step approaches, with nature-based approaches, like you're saying, the yoga, the pieces that, the more woo-woo we say, the more woo-woo it is, the more people I see getting better long-term. I don't mean like when we're doing card readings or whatever, but I mean the more integrated we can be with the body-mind treatments, the better the outcomes. That's what I see in both the research and in anecdotal evidence from people who've gone through programs. The more clinically based it is, the more I see people kind of tuning it out because they've already been through so much clinical work. So I feel like some of the programs really have a lot to learn, and some of the programs that are a little bit woo-woo need better funding. And so I think we need to take risks. I think we need to take risks of being a little bit woo-woo at the risk of not getting the kind of NIMH or the federal grants that we would love. And that becomes one of those fights between psychology and funders. And so that's not super, super relevant. But I do think that the more we can support those programs that are doing integrative work, the better.
And does it mean, from your comments there, that the places that are then doing more of that integrative work are pretty much just going to be the ones that are available to the people who have the money to pay it? Like they're not going to appear or be available through insurance to someone who just otherwise couldn't afford it?
With American insurance, basically treatment isn't really accessible at all anyway. Even clinically based or hospital-based programs are hard to access. Treatment is very much horribly unavailable. We need more and more, I think, community-based programs, and those will come from people who, in recovery, go back into the community and say, okay, this was my experience and this is how I got better. Because the clinically based programs, at least in the US, when you have a capitalist based system, it's impossible to get coverage for very long. And so you have those revolving door, and they're very short-sighted. American insurance is very short-sighted. And so they say, oh, well, her vitals are up, his vitals are up, he's eating now, so I guess he's okay. Out he goes again, relapses, comes right back in. It becomes incredibly costly. The long-term programs, the ones that do the integrative work, those are in the long run more cost-effective.
So let's then chat about your second memoir, Madness. So this, as I said at the start, it kind of picks up where Wasted had left off. But are you able to give a bit of an overview of what this one is about?
Yeah, absolutely. It's about bipolar disorder. And again, we only know what we know when we know it. That book came out in 2008. I have a new book coming out. I've had several books since then, but I have a new book coming out now that kind of reflects a lot of knowledge I've gained in the last 10 years. But that particular book deals with the really critical years of my bipolar disorder. I have bipolar type 1. So they always, when you say you have bipolar type 1, the doctor's eyes kind of widen and they go, oh, golly. But of course, what it is really quite manageable over time and with the right supports. And so it deals with some pretty critical high it's like a high-speed chase of a book. And it picks up after the eating disorder treatments. And when I was in my 20s and 30s, it covers the years of my 20s and 30s, when I was dealing with very severe mania and depressions, like you do with manic depression. And it also deals in the end with, as I was coming out of the darkest period of that illness, it begins to shed some light on how mental health recovery can be possible. And that's what I'm getting at in my 6th book, which comes out next year.
Okay. And I mean, you referenced bipolar type 1. I imagine that many listeners will only have a vague idea of what bipolar is. So can you describe what that is? And then sort of what is the difference between bipolar type 1 and type 2?
Sure. Well, I mean, to some extent, bipolar for starters is the common name for manic depression. And what it is, it's characterized by swings between mania and depression with periods of what's called euthymia in between, periods of stability and relative emotional equilibrium in between. Type 1 is the type that has the manic breaks, the really severe kind of, like I said, the high-speed chase of mental health. The depressions are very, very severe, very dark, very deep. Bipolar type 2, people are, at least this is what the research shows right now, and that's always changing, but bipolar type 2 doesn't have full-blown manias. People go into what's called hypomania. And so it's a lower grade mania, but it can still be very damaging. What they deal with instead is a more chronic, kind of pervasive, corrosive depression. And I think either one is a very hard hand of cards to be dealt. But that's the distinction between bipolar 1 and 1 and 2.
And so in the book, you describe the mania and the depressive states really well, but I guess it would be useful to give the audience a bit of a taste of that or get a bit of a sense of it. So when you're in a manic state, what does it feel like? What's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when you're in a manic state at the very beginning, it starts slow. And so it builds gradually. So, but when you're in a manic state, it can, at first feel very wonderfully, like it just feels better than, it's happier than happy. Everything in bipolar, it's like the volume gets turned way up on it. It's like the same emotions, but with the volume amped. And so happy is incredibly happy, excited is incredibly excited. You get very, very rapid in your thinking, in your speech. I'm already rapid in my speech, but that's quite natural for me. But you can, as the mania progresses, become grandiose. You can become incredibly impulsive. It can get very dangerous. People have a lot of car accidents. People buy a lot of stuff if they have the means to do so. People can become sexually extremely active. They become self-harm. People struggle with self-harm when they're dealing with bipolar mania. And so those are the kind of acting out. They're called goal-seeking behaviors. And that's kind of the acting out phase of mania. And then at the far end of the spectrum, when it's very, very severe and unchecked, people can become psychotic, become delusional, delusions of grandeur, which is like where, if I'm having a delusion of grandeur, I'm not thinking my name is Marya, I'm thinking I'm, the Queen of England. And so religious delusions are quite common. And so it becomes a psychotic disorder at that point rather than simply strictly a mood disorder. And so that whole arc from the very, very happy to a very, very troubling and dangerous psychosis, that all of that can be encompassed in the span of one mania. And typically it's followed by a pretty hard crash.
And so then the hard crash is what's going on there? What's it like?
Yeah. It's incredibly deep depression. The crash feels literally, it's like your body crashed into a wall. The depressions that follow manias are very, very deep, very, very, the word I want to use is heavy. It's like there's a horrible weight on you. It feels like your heart is breaking all the time, or else some people go into a catatonic depression where you're not feeling anything at all. You're not talking, you're not moving, you're not doing anything. You're just basically curled up in a ball. And those catatonic depressions are very dangerous. And then those intermediary periods between depression and mania are also pretty dangerous as well. They can be called mixed episodes, where you're dealing with both the negative feeling and perception of a depression and the energetic out of controlness of a mania. Those mixed states are very, very dangerous. People with bipolar have a very high rate of suicide, the highest of any of the psychiatric disorders. Between 15 and 20% of people with bipolar commit suicide. And that's horribly, horribly high. And the research is still out on why it's so high. And people are still working very, very hard to try and cut back on that very high rate.
And I think you described it as like a car chase of a book. There is just this intensity to your writing. And there were moments where I was like, I'm going to have to just put this down and have a break because you're just, right. And look, I have never suffered with a mental illness, but the closest I can come to any similarities is having some bad experiences on drugs. And I've had some wonderful experiences and I've also had some bad experiences. But even with the bad experiences, I never sort of lost a sense of self in terms of there was always a remembrance of, okay, I've done something, this is going to end at some point. I just need to wait out this badness. But I get the sense within the book is there isn't that realization. It just becomes the new reality. You don't realize, okay, this is what's happening. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And that's really insightful too, because I think one of the things to recognize about living with a mental health disorder like bipolar or depression or OCD or any of the severe disorders, schizophrenia, all of those, it isn't going to end to an extent. You know, when you have a condition like this, we don't now have a cure for mental illness. And so when you're in those extreme states, whether it's psychosis or mania or depression, when you're in that extremity, it feels very intense, it feels very extreme, and it also feels like there's no end point. The trick to recovery, if there's any one trick, the real trick is to recognize this will pass. You know, that you have to have that tiny bit of insight to know, okay, right now I'm curled up on a bed and I can't move and I can't talk and I can't cry. But this will pass. And recognizing that is very, very hard when you're in that emotional state. It's such an acute emotional state that, I would have loved during those years when it was really, really severe, I would have loved to have been able to put my own life down and take a break, and that's why I'm sure the book has that feeling to it, is that I'm sure people reading it need to take a break. And now in my life, in the aftermath of those very severe years, when I experience, whether it's hypomania or depression or any of the things I still do experience, the real key is recognizing, and when I can't recognize it, asking someone else to tell me this will pass. This has got to end.
Are there other, misunderstandings that you think that people have around mental illness or specifically bipolar? And this can be either people who actually have those conditions, and you're like, I really wish people would know this, or it can be more the general public where you're like, I wish people know this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think on both counts, there are a lot of things I wish people were more aware of when it comes to bipolar and mental illness in general. First of all, it's not a death sentence. I think, again, that perception of chronicity and permanence is really damaging, because it leads people who have the disorders to believe, I've just been diagnosed with bipolar or schizophrenia or whatever. That's it. I'm done. And that's not even kind of true. It's not even kind of true. But that certainly is the widespread perception, is that if you have a severe mental illness, that's what you'll do. That's what you have now, and that's your life. In fact, going back to what I said right when we started talking, that's not actually a primary or persistent or even very frequent part of my self-perception. Yes, I have bipolar, but it's just like, it really, for me now, after all this time, it is like having diabetes. I do what I need to do to take care of it. And when it flares up, and I take care of it again. That doesn't make the dealing with it pleasant, but it does mean that I get to go on with my life. I'm a professor, I'm a journalist, I write books, I go on, and I think one of the things that I also wish people would recognize is that they can do more for themselves in terms of recovery than the doctors are telling us. The doctors who I love dearly and respect and admire, they don't know very much about mental illness at this point. They don't know about where it comes from. They don't know why it happens very much. They know a little bit about the brain elements of it, but what they don't know very much about is what we can do to do better in our own lives. And so that's something we have to kind of resource on our own. So there has to be a lot more active engagement by those of us who have the disorder in terms of figuring out what works for us. And that is where recovery comes into play.
And is that part of your reason for writing the book? I know you obviously only touch on that very much towards the end, but to try and give people a better understanding with bipolar and what are some of the remedies or the things that could be helped or helping them out that aren't normally recommended or isn't going to be coming necessarily from their doctor?
Right. I think that's what I'm doing with my new book. The new book is called We've Been Healing All Along, Stories from the Road to Mental Health. And in it, I've interviewed about 1,500 people now. And those people, most of them have mental illness themselves. But the reason I went about this book was to find out, okay, if I'm doing so much better than I was ever told I would, somebody else is probably doing so much better than anybody told them they would, right? So I'm not the only one doing fine. And indeed, I'm not the only one doing fine. So what I've been discovering is how all these people individually, quite independently of each other and quite independently of the fields of mental health, are finding ways to make their lives work with or without a mental illness. And so that's why I'm doing this next book. The reason I wrote Madness was because there was and is such misperception around what bipolar actually is. People see you as kind of this wild-eyed, cart-pushing person who just can't get their life together and who is just difficult. And I wanted to break some of that stigma down by telling the story. But the next book is really more about what are some of those strategies for getting your life back on track.
And at the back of Madness, you share some stats about bipolar, which were, both illuminating and worrying. And my copy of Madness was published in 2009, so it's nearly 10 years old. So the figures may have shifted somewhat, but my sense is probably not that much. And one of the stats that jumped out was that the average age of onset for bipolar is 23, but the average age for a correct diagnosis is 40. So this is an incredibly long time. So what is the reason it takes so long, if you know? Yeah, I do. There are a couple of reasons, but the primary one is that there are two primary reasons. The first is that psychiatric diagnosis is directed primarily by the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Disorders, which is really a malfunctional document. And all it does really is tell people what your diagnostic code is. It doesn't tell people anything about what caused your disorder. It doesn't tell people anything about how to treat your disorder. It just tells them what your number is on a chart. And so when you go into a psychiatrist and say, okay, so here are my symptoms, you're more likely to go in when you're feeling awful and you will be diagnosed with depression. You're not likely to go in when you're feeling grandiose or feeling really fantastic or buying lots of clothes or whatever the things are when you're having those kind of more positive or at least less destructive
symptoms of bipolar. And so bipolar is hard to diagnose because we usually are diagnosed with depression first. Also, many people with bipolar have co-occurring disorders like eating disorders or drug and alcohol addiction. The rate of drug and alcohol addiction is very, very high in bipolar. And that's both genetic and characterological in origin. And so you may get seen for your alcohol addiction when you're 17, but they're going to treat you for your alcohol addiction and not necessarily know that you have bipolar. And so there's lots and lots of misleading factors. There's lots and lots of misdiagnostic cues. There's lots of missed cues. There's lots of hints that are there that people don't see. And then there's the simple fact that psychiatry is very bound up in a very diagnostic procedure also.
And as well as that, I mean, at the end of the book, you also list a breakdown of the costs of your medication and supplements and therapy and psychiatric visits and hospital stays. And the cost of this stuff is not cheap, and a fair amount of it is out of pocket and not covered by insurance. So reading this list, it also maybe made me think part of the reason people aren't kind of either A, getting better, but B, also getting the diagnosis that they need is they just aren't able to afford to go to the places to get done adequately.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely true. And the fact of it is that I'm reading a lot right now on what's more effective in terms of treatment. And the most effective treatment, we don't know. We don't know whether the meds are more effective than psychotherapy, but it doesn't look like they are substantially more effective. A lot of people need both, and both the medications and psychotherapy are expensive. It depends on what country you're in. It depends on what kind of coverage you have, of course. But the best approach, really, it does cost money. The one thing I would say about that is that many of those stats in the back of the book, the stats about the field haven't changed. I, however, am on vastly fewer medications. I need a whole lot less therapy. I need a lot less care than I used to. And so the costs for me personally have gone way, way, way down as I have gotten better at doing things in my own life to keep myself well. And so actually some of the most effective things for bipolar, depression, schizophrenia, anything like that, the severe mental illnesses, a lot of the things that are most effective are free, like sleeping. That's sleeping is, number one on my list of meds. Food, another one, way high on the list of meds. It's not free, but it's certainly not as expensive as, say, lithium. And so some of the techniques that we can use to keep ourselves well really are lifestyle based. And that's a hopeful thing.
Okay. And so is that part of then what is coming out in this new book? It's almost like an afterwards for madness in the same way as you did a very brief afterwards for Wasted, but you're now doing a whole book as an afterwards for madness?
It is and it isn't. It's not a memoir. And
Okay.
I've been doing the research on it for about 5 years now. So the research base is much different than it was for either of the memoirs. I've been interviewing neuroscientists and psychiatrists and people with mental illness themselves and people who work in the fields and people who research and blah, 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 blah. So it's a really different kind of book. But what it does do is take a look at, what really do we know about the brain and what really can we do on the ground here and now in our day-to-day lives. And it talks a lot about the conflicts in the field. There are a lot of conflicts in the field between psychiatry and neuroscience, between neuroscience and behavioral health providers. You're very aware of some of those controversies that exist right now. And part of what that book does is talk about, okay, here are the controversies and here's the bottom line for us, those of us who deal with mental illness on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. And it has been sort of 10 years since the book was written. And I think towards the end of the book, it was at a stage where often in the summertime, you would be having moments of mania. And then in the wintertime, you were having more tendency towards depression. And it seemed like that was a pretty yearly thing. Is that where you're at now, or it's more spaced out? How is your mental health?
I haven't, my mental health is great. I haven't had a hospitalization since 2007. So since before the year before the book came out. And in the book, there are, 14 hospitalizations or something crazy like that. But I haven't been hospitalized in many, many years. And part of that is simply getting better at managing it. And part of it is I'm not on medication, some of which I really didn't need to be on. Some part of it is that I'm on the right doses, everything like that. So there's a lot of pieces that go into recovery, but I haven't been hospitalized in a long time. I don't really deal with extreme manias anymore. I still deal with some low-grade depression. And that is more than anything just corrosive. It's it's annoying. It's like there's this dog yapping and nipping at your heels. That's really and it's annoying, but you just kind of deal with the dog. You just kind of go, well, the dog's back. Actually, William Styron, in that beautiful memoir, Darkness Visible, wrote, he called depression the black dog. And so he'd say he was having a visit from the black dog. And that really is how it is. When depression comes, it's kind of present, and you just kind of do what you need to do to take care of it. When mania or hypomania, as I experience it now, comes, I don't use my credit cards. I don't have credit cards. I don't shop. I don't buy, I don't do anything impulsive. I recognize it. And a lot of it is, a lot of managing mental illness comes from experimenting over time with what works. And what you really need is the insight to say, oh, this is happening. Now, how can I make this better? Instead of saying, oh, this is happening, I'm going to ride this high till I crash. That's a very big difference in terms of outcome.
Yeah. So look, I would like to shift focus a little bit. And I mean, at the very beginning, you described yourself as a writer and a journalist, and that's what you do. And so I would love to kind of chat a little bit about your writing process. And we've talked about your two memoirs. I mean, how do you go about putting a memoir together? And I know that's a very broad question, but we can start there and we can kind of drill down from there.
Sure. Well, the two I have written were written in very different ways. The process was very different. With Wasted, I wrote almost from the beginning to the end. It's a very chronological structure. It's a traditional memoir in that it goes from point A to point C with B in between. With Madness, because it's so reflective of the fragmentation that one experiences mentally with mental illness, the structure is very fragmented. So I wrote Madness in kind of fits and starts. I'd write a scene here and a scene there, and a passage there and a passage here. And then I wrote, when I realized I'd written everything I had to say about it, I kind of laid all these things out on a very long table and shuffled them around until they had the logic of the book that you see. And so totally different processes, but the writing itself has to do with, and this is, now this is me with my writing teacher hat on. The writing has to do with recognizing that you are dealing with a very focused period of time. A memoir is not an autobiography. An autobiography is comprehensive. It details everything. It assumes everything's important. A memoir is a very, very focused piece of work. It's a genre that deals only with the subject matter, right? And so I have one eating disorder memoir, one mental health memoir, and I don't have an autobiography out, nor do I need one, because most of my life is really, really dull. And we don't need to be comprehensive about my life. I had a couple of things that I knew a lot about, and so I wrote memoirs about those things. And so when you are writing a memoir, when one is writing a memoir, you have to remember that not everything is relevant. In fact, almost nothing is relevant. Only those things that contribute to that particular story get to stay. That's really, I think, the thing to be aware of.
And that's probably the part that then makes Madness, and I'm referencing Madness just because I'm remembering it better now because I've read it most recently, makes it so intense because you really sort of concertinaed all of the timeline into only the bits that are about that part. And so you kind of get the impression that that's what it's like all the time, because there isn't any of the dullness there. So I think that adds to the intensity of it, which is obviously what you're trying to get across as part of a memoir like that.
Sure. I mean, that's very true. A memoir is very distilled. So when people read my memoirs, I always get such a giggle when they say, "Oh, I feel like I know you so well." I'm like, "Oh my gosh, you don't know almost anything about me," and I am honored on the one hand by people saying, "Oh, I feel like I know you so well," because what they know is, a personality or a style. But what they don't know is, like, I look ridiculous in the morning and I wear blue pajamas and I, wander around the house and, talk to my dogs when no one is home. And we all have very, very ordinary lives in many ways. And I think there's a real beauty to that. Maybe someday I'll write a book about all the ordinariness in my life. It will be my favorite book. It will be my very favorite book of my own.
And in terms of just getting down everything that happened and remembering this, like, how much of this is coming from memory versus how much of it is being filled in by family and friends and ex-partners and all of that?
Yeah, I think people go about it differently, but I come from a journalistic background. And so my instinct is to go right to the sources. I had years and years and years of journals and notebooks and records and emails and letters and all of these sources that I could go to find out exactly, to the best of their ability and my recollection, I could go right to the source. I interviewed my parents for I don't even know how many hours for both of those books, probably 30, 40 hours apiece. And I interviewed ex-partners, many, many friends, siblings, relatives, teachers, bosses, and so all of those people have been incredibly instrumental in helping me remember accurately. The other thing I have done in both cases is have the book go through a series of readers after the drafts were done for fact checking. Just like you would an article. And so that's why I have always felt pretty strongly that people, when you're writing memoir, you don't have to do it just, quote, to the best of your recollection. You can really get down there and find out what happened.
And the way that you describe things, the tension and the drama and just the illustrative nature of the words and the phrases you use. I mean, when I was reading Madness, it was no surprise when you then talk about the fact that you write poetry and you took poetry classes. And so, how do you feel poetry has helped you as a writer, even if you're writing prose instead of poetry?
Oh, I love poetry so much. In fact, that's mostly what I read. I mostly read poetry and essays. I think poetry teaches me a lot about the economy of language. So there's not a lot of wasted words when I'm writing, or I try to cut them in the editing process. Poetry really is so imagistically profound. There's so much image, there's so much metaphor, there's so much beautiful language, and there's such good choices made. When you're writing a poem, there's no wasting of words. You don't have time. And when you're reading poetry, I think that just makes you more instinctively aware of which words belong, which don't, which images are strongest and which are kind of weak, what has the best ring in terms of the music of the language that you're using. And so I think, when I'm teaching, I have all of my students read poetry. I mean, regardless of what I'm teaching. Well, maybe not when I'm teaching journalism, but when I'm teaching nonfiction or fiction or poetry, I always have people read the poetry for the language and for the economy of it.
Is there other advice that you would want to share with writers, or like one thing you wish you'd known earlier in your career than that you know now?
Yeah, I think you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I think the thing that I recommend for most people is that if you want to write a novel, read a lot of novels. If you want to write a memoir, read a lot of memoirs. Read a lot of variety of memoirs. Read a lot of memoirs that have to do with nothing to do with your topic. If you want to write a novel in fragments, read lots of fragmented novels. And, you don't have to start from the ground up, because what will happen and this happens a lot with new writers, is that they write things that have been written before. We all have kind of an ear for what we think things should sound like, and that's what we hear first. You have to dig below that to get to your own voice, to get to what's really original. And so to do that, you have to read what's already been done. And then you'll find out what's new and what's original to you as a writer.
And you said before about your life is pretty boring outside of what was written in the memoirs. I mean, do you have another memoir in you? Is there another part of your life that you feel is an interesting story that hasn't been covered? And I know this kind of sounds like an absurd question because you've already written 2 and most people don't write 2 memoirs. But yeah,
right.
Wondering.
A lot of memoirists write like 5 memoirs. There's memoirists are... it's a form. And when you get used to writing in that form, it becomes pretty effective for you. So I'm certainly not the first memoirist to do it twice. But I think, probably not another memoir. I'm working on right now what will come out after this book on mental health and recovery is a collection of essays. And so that's not a memoir. It's a really different format. It's a really different structure, but it is first person. So there is more story to tell. It's not, but I don't have another memoir to the best of my knowledge at this time. On the other hand, I'm only 44, which I know sounds really old when you're 22, but if you're looking at, I got another half a life to go here. So I wouldn't put it past me, but I think probably I have changed my approach enough that probably my next books will be journalism, essay, and novel. And maybe one of these days I'll do a collection of poetry. Okay.
Fine. No, it was just when I was reading through Madness, and also it was touched on in Wasted, just thinking about a memoir on alcoholism. And I know you touch on it there in both of those books, but yeah, if you then really focused on that particular topic, it felt like there could probably be another memoir in there.
Oh, probably. But I feel like there are some brilliant memoirs on alcoholism. I don't know that I have anything to add to those. I think the ones that have been done are really beautiful.
Okay. And how was it for you sort of becoming sober, and how did you compare that to, I don't know, an eating disorder, or is it blurrier because they were sort of intertwined?
It's a great question. I think, the fundamental, the one thing I can point to in terms of getting my mental health back, the one thing I can point to that I did was get sober. That helped. The meds, some of them help, some of them don't. The yoga, sure, it helps most of the time. But what really makes the fundamental physiological difference for me in terms of managing my bipolar is staying sober. And that's really important, because so many people with bipolar and with schizophrenia and with depression and with the other mental health disorders, so many of us deal with substance abuse. It's not even funny. And it is really literally like pouring gasoline on a fire. And so if you want to stay sick, keep doing it. If you want to get better, you might want to stop. And so that's something I always do want to let people know, is that makes a fundamental difference to the brain. I mean, just very, very basic biology and chemistry. So getting sober was initially really, really hard. And in that way, it was very much like the eating disorder. Initially, it was very, very hard. And then it was just run of the mill. After a period of time, you just get used to not drinking. In the same way you get used to just eating when it's time to eat. And so those things it's like, you have to remember, I think, that it's a return to your body's natural state. It is not your body's natural state to binge and purge. It is not your body's natural state to starve. None of those are where your body likes to be. In the same way, your body doesn't really like to be drunk. And so when you return your body to homeostasis, when you return your body to baseline, it's really grateful, and it works a lot better for you, and your brain works a lot better. So both the eating disorder and the alcohol, once those were eliminated from my life, everything got a lot easier. It just got a lot easier after that.
Well, look, I think that's a good place to finish up with this. And so, Marya, thank you so much for coming on the show and for chatting with me. I'm a huge fan of your work, and it was a pleasure to be able to speak with you.
Oh, thank you.
Before I let you go,
wonderful to speak with you.
People want to know more about you. Where should they head? And you can put sort of website, if you do social media, tell them that, and then different books that you want to point people towards. And I'll put all of this in the show notes.
Oh, wonderful. Absolutely. Yes. Go to my website or go to my Facebook page. I have an author page. I also have a personal page. I friend everybody. So I'd love to connect with folks. It's maryahornbacher.com. And on Facebook and Twitter, I'm just Marya Hornbacher.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you again for your time, Marya. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been a delight. Thanks so much, Chris.
Thanks for